Fantastic.
Okay, thank you.
Great.
We're going to have IT staff running up and down. If you have any problems, give us a holler.
Okay, thank you.
Just by yourself.
Okay, well, the camera is terrible.
Can you guys hear us online? Where's the chat?
Yes, thanks, Anne.
Yes, we can hear it.
Okay.
Awesome.
Well, welcome to the session. We're going to wait another minute or so because there have been delays in the agenda.
So usually we'll work with the GCPs around
Are you like?
Yeah, I mean, I'm the first one.
So it's very, it's not very fast.
I'm going.
Nightmare.
Like, why don't you just stand already over here? I'm going to introduce you. Kick
Okay,
us off and introduce you.
okay.
Signal whenever.
Oh, did it. So, good morning and welcome to this first part of the session, Permafrost and Hydrology. My name is Melissa Schwab, and in my name of my co-moderator, Simon, I would thank all the presenters today in Fairbanks and, of course, online on Zoom. The Permafrost and Hydrodynamic session is divided into two parts. So today is the first part and tomorrow is the second part. Make sure, please, to come. Posters are also today for the people in Fairbanks. Talks normally consist of 7 minutes. We have 5 minutes presentation and 2 minutes question. After 5 minutes, I give you like a warning. And after 7 minutes, I cut you off ruthlessly. So this is a warning from my side. So we accept and encourage questions and eager discussions, so please do that and keep that in mind. Today we have 8 speakers, and we start with Simon Slivak. Sorry, I really have, it's a wonderfully German name, I'm sorry. Who's talking, going to talk about like INSAR and how he's using it to use tracks as subsidence and permafrost regions.
Okay, well, thank you for the introduction. So today I'm going to talk about how we can identify ground ice in the permafrost, more specifically at the top of the permafrost from space. And that's important because ground ice really is foundational to these Arctic ecosystems. When the ground ice disappears, so when we have permafrost degradation, that changes the hydrological functioning, the ecological functioning, and also the geomorphology of these ecosystems. Unfortunately, we currently don't have good maps of where the permafrost is ice rich, even on small scales, but even less so on larger scales. So what I'm going to talk about today is how we can use kind of subtle fingerprint in the subsidence that we track from satellites to identify where the permafrost is rich in ground ice. And the key idea is the following. We're going to look at very warm summers. And you can imagine that from the surface down over the summer, the thaw front progresses deeper and deeper down. And if it hits ice-rich materials that are at the top of the permafrost, that will happen towards the end of the season, then we expect to see an acceleration in subsidence. Because then the thaw front hits these materials that are rich in ice, and when the ice melts and the water drains away, we see subsidence at the end of summer. And we're going to do that with Sentinel-1 data, and let's just look at a few examples, and this will be pretty bad for the people who try it online, but I'm going to point with my hand. So let's just look at this area here near Kivalina in northwestern Alaska during 2019, an extremely warm summer. And we'll start here at an inactive floodplain where we don't expect to see a lot of ice at the top of the permafrost and close to the surface. Why is that? Because that landscape, that part, that ecological unit is pretty young. So what does the subsidence signal look like? Initially, we get subsidence just after snowmelt, and then the position of the surface is relatively stable. It's consistent with our expectations that there isn't a lot of excess ground ice at greater depths or at the top of the permafrost. please click. Let's look at the site here. So we're going to go up the hill slope. But here at the toe slope, you can, if you squint, you will see ice wedge polygons. So that already tells us visually that we expect this part to be ice rich. And let's look at the subseasonal subsidence. We can again see an initial subsidence just after snowmelt, and it slows down as the thaw front. We interpret this to be the thaw front progressing through the central part of the active layer, which is desiccated. And then it hits these ice-rich materials deeper down, and we see this acceleration of subsidence, consistent with our inference based on visual interpretation that this region is ice-rich. Okay, finally, let's move further up the hill slope towards a ridge area, and there we don't have any conspicuous indicators that this region is ice-rich. So let's look at the subseasonal subsidence pattern, and again, we see this massive acceleration of subsidence at the end of summer. And this uniquely basically tells us, or is a unique indicator, that this ridge here is rich in ground ice at the top of the permafrost. So we tested this idea using 2 data sets, and I'll introduce the first one now. So here now we're looking at an entire image of a small part of our study area where we have the late season subsidence with, that's the subsidence in August, basically, with purple areas having a bottom subsidence at the end of this very warm season. And we compare that to an expert assessment based on ecotypes and visual manifestations of ground ice, of permafrost ground ice, where we see in those areas that are shown in purple here, I was confident that these regions are ice rich. Then there are also regions which show up, and these generally have very strong late season subsidence. We also have these gray areas, which I determined to be, I was sufficiently confident that they were ice poor. For instance, those are rocky outcrops or bedrock outcrops, such as these ones, are also active flames, or very, very young inactive flames. And these generally, or almost perfectly, you will see the statistics later, have very, very low late season subsidence. And then finally, we also have these indeterminate regions where I just couldn't tell whether they were ice rich or not, because they lack obvious manifestations of ground. And it turns out that a lot of them are ice rich, such as the ridge we saw earlier, at least if we trust our late season subsidence interpretation. Okay, thank you. Let's go to the next one. And so we can plot the statistics, and we also had some ice cores from this region. We're looking here at the late season subsidence on the horizontal axis, and you can see for those that were determined to be ice poor, either based on my mapping or based on these cores, we have very low late season subsidence. For those that were independently determined to be ice rich, we have very strong late season subsidence, with these two distributions basically not overlapping. There's a very clear separation in this extremely warm summer. And what's also interesting is that these indeterminate regions, they also show pretty much the same binodal distribution. So one way you could interpret this is that in our region, there really is quite a strong separation between those areas that have a lot of ground ice at the top of permafrost and those that have very, very little excess ice at the top of permafrost, but not a lot in between. But obviously, interpreting these signals is much more complicated. There are various factors that play into this, and that's something we're working on. But for today, the key take-home message is that based on this late season subsidence in this extremely warm summer, we can reliably separate ice poor with ice rich terrain based on these independent assessments. Thank you. That was my talk. I hope I didn't spend too much time.
No, you will have like 30 seconds left.
Yeah.
What data did you use to determine the seasonal subsidence?
That's Sentinel-1 data.
Sentinel-1. All right.
Okay, good.
Okay, thank you. Thanks
Let's
for the
go
question.
to the next speaker. Timian Anchen is remote.
Okay. Well,
Hi everyone, I'm here.
Light? Oh.
Hello, can you hear me?
we can.
Great.
Thank you. So we're going to, do you want to share the screen?
I can share the screen if that's possible.
Oh, I hope so.
I can also open.
Are you able to share your screen?
I think I
Yes.
Okay,
Can everyone here see it now?
we can. Perfect. Thank you.
Great, thank you. So hello everyone. I wish I could go in person, but this Friday I have my first PhD student gonna defend, so I have to attend his defense. So that's why I have to attend this one remotely. So my talk, the title here is monitoring soil, water, and organic carbon storage patterns using spaceborne INSAR data. And thanks to a previous talk, INSAR is a remote sensing technique that is capable of measuring surface deformation with usually millimeter to centimeter level accuracy, depending on the region and the processing strategy, with a spatial resolution usually on the tens to hundreds of meters. And I want to acknowledge that this work is funded by NASA's Terrestrial Hydrology Program and as a future investigator in Earth and Space Science Technology Program. And I'm really greatly appreciate that Bob invited us to be affiliated project, and I look forward to contribute and work with the members here, because I find studying permafrost is a very fascinating area. So the reason that we can use INSAR subsidence map to study the permafrost is because there is a top portion of the layer that is called the active layer above the permafrost that will freeze and thaw annually. And because the density of the water and the ice is different, so when the ice thaws in the summer, the surface well settled, and the INSAR can pick up usually the centimeter level surface deformation due to the active freeze and thaw. And earlier you probably hear talk from Kevin that people has been using this type of information to develop method to retrieve the active layer thickness. And that typically require some auxiliary data because INSAR deformation is not directly proportional to the active layer. You can have a very deep, very dried active layer, and then you wouldn't see any subsidence because that is a water that in the active layer that produces the deformation. So you have to have a very wet soil to have a large subsidence. But on the other hand, if we can measure the INSAR subsidence map, and that actually gives us a direct interpretation of how much water are there in the soil. For example, if there are 10 centimeter of liquid water column freeze, you will detect 8 millimeter of uplift. So the ability to capture this fine deformation give you a direct measure of the water that is stayed in the active layer. For the permafrost hydrology, to me, that's a very important measurement on its own beside the active layer. So that's what we did. We analyzed the ALOS data acquired between 2006 to 2011, and derived the mean seasonal subsidence between early June, the beginning of the thaw season, to late July, that's approaching to the end of the thaw season. And this is the surface subsidence map we see. And we generally see range from 0 to 8 centimeter of deformation. And we translate that map into a soil water map, that map to 0 to 80 centimeter of soil water column. And so this map actually makes sense. We did a rigorous analysis based on radar theory about the uncertainty. We identified the uncertainties about a centimeter. And so the 4 to 5 centimeter of soil subsidence map is likely above the noise level. However, when we tried to publish this result, the reviewer said, you really need in situ validation to convince me this is actually the true surface ground deformation related with active freeze and thaw. So as a remote sensing person, that was a dead end because before I didn't go to field, I don't have in situ validation. But luckily we met the team member, Bayani and George, who trained me and my student actually went to the Tulik area and collect the in situ validation. So here in the red diamond shows the field side we went to near the field station back in 2008, and the star shows the field side we were able to get to in 2019. And you can see the spatial coverage was greatly expanded in the second year, and that was due to the helicopter support we got from NSF. And so that really greatly improved the location we can go to. And now comes the question, now we can go to those places, what we can actually measure to validate INSAR result. And that is what we called the O'Connor method. One of the students in our team went to the Tulik 7 years even before this project started. And together we modified the protocol and derived the things. So if we look at the active soil layer, you can see they have a three very distinguished layers. The top layer is called acroton. It contains live plants, and the cataton is a dead plant. So these two layers are rich organic soil layers. And below that usually typically has a low organic soil content mineral soil layer that looks very clayish with very low porosity. So what we need to measure here is we adopted a simple 3-layer soil model. And in order to validate INSAR's surface deformation measurement, we need to know how much water are there in the soil. That requires to measure the depth of each layer, the porosity of each layer, as well as the water table. This is very critical because INSAR is sensitive to the saturated soil water thickness. In the aquitone, it's very porous, has a lot of pores, 90% of porosity. So if it's not saturated, the water can just freeze and expand to occupy these empty pores without causing any subsidence. And that's why we need to measure the water tables here. And here is how we actually did it. We did this at all those over 100, 200 sites. At each site, we dig those locations, and that allows us to measure the depth of the 3 soil layer. We collect the soil samples, which we can later measure the porosity in the lab. As long as we also can see the water table, which allows us to see that how much of the saturated layer that is. And we collect those samples, and this is great. But then one of the questions we have is this field measurement is very noisy. If you walk 5 meters apart, you collect a sample, it will look very, very different. And so how do we compare those measurements with actual INSAR measurement? So the agreement is that, well, INSAR pixel is really 50, 60 meter size, right? So just trying to match to that particular field size within, there's a lot of variation even within that 1 pixel. But if we keep collecting a large number of numbers, so after the year 2, as we collect more data, when we plot those measurements as a histogram, what we find is the histogram converge, which means we actually have enough samples to capture the general spread of the soil properties over a regional scale. So we fit to the normal distribution to those field measurements. And then this allows us to run some Monte Carlo simulation to draw realistic measurement property values and simulate what would be possible values we can see from INSAR. And this is the agreement we can get. So based on those field measurement, those histogram of the soil property, we predict overall on average, there's a 30 centimeter of saturated soil water thickness over this region. And it could agree with INSAR pretty much within a couple centimeters. That's the water depth. So that's actually a very, very good agreement. You can see a wider spread for the field measurement estimate. That's just because of the heterogeneity in the field measurements, so they tend to have a longer tail. But as overall, their mean and their variation are very consistent. And one last note, what we have found here is that while we are collecting them, we find because the INSAR is sensitive to where the water are, and the plants require water to grow. So the amount of water that is available usually has a strong influence on what can grow there. And what we have found both from the field measurement and the INSAR measurement is that the observed deformation amount that's proportional to the amount of water correlates with land cover map. So sedges near the riparian zone, you see a higher deformation, and heath on the ridge top is a dry soil. You can have a very thick active layer, but there's no water, and you see a very little amount of deformation. And so this is not—
Thank you, Anne. You're a little bit over your time already. I'm sorry.
Sorry about that. And that's at the end. I just want to add one note is that this data set, we are also able to measure the soil carbon and the soil organic nitrogen from those 200 data set. There's a delay, but it will be available later next year. And then we look forward to share this data set with the community when it is ready.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Okay, well, thanks, Anne. The next speaker is going to be my co-convener, Melissa, and she's going to talk. I have to share the screen. She's going to talk about hyperspectral remote sensing. So we're moving away from microwave remote sensing.
Yes, wait, I should open it so.
Okay.
Try to get back some time. So you all know, like, that the map open borders is very important for research, for monitoring, and of course for water management and irrigation as well. That's why it is so important to have like really high resolution maps. for this. And remote sensing is a perfect tool to get like a high spatial, but also temporal resolution. Unfortunately, our research satellites are kind of in a coarse resolution, medium to coarse resolution, which is like, which means that we can map water bodies up to down to 2 kilometers. However, with various and hyperspectral data, we can go a little bit lower than that. And this is what I'm trying to do in this kind of little exercise. So in 2017, Aviers flew over the outer delta, and this is basically 27 lines here that combine about 5,080 square kilometers. You can go a little further. So what I did is trying to use already established water indices and compare them. For example, we have the normalized difference water index, the modified normalized difference water index, the multiband water index in a single band at 20 to 20 nanometers. And what I did is calculating these water indices, and then due to impurities of the lines, of the flight lines, or like really dark vegetation behind kind of outliers within these indices and water mass, which I then removed, and then I filled them. One further, I filled them with nearest neighbors interpolation to get a really smooth map, and then I used also thresholding. Also thresholding, which is a non-parametric dynamic thresholding system to really find the perfect threshold, a cutoff point for what is a water body and what is land surface, which I will show in like a diagram here. After this,
Sorry, yeah, and could you please speak up?
oh, sorry.
Yeah,
I guess
voices.
closer to the microphone. What you see here is basically that you have the water body section here, but due to changes in morphology and vegetation, this kind of threshold can change. That's why we use like this automated non-parametric threshold finder. Can you go one further?
Sure.
And then the final extracted mask is then compared to a reference mask. I chose the S4, which is uses Ka bands. And then I computed a confusion matrix. And as you can see, like the N and WI, like in the middle, represents or reproduces the ER-squared reference max the best. So just let's look into detail. We have like an RGB image in the upper left corner, the smart reference image, the single band, the NDVI, the modified NDVI, and the multi-band water index here. What you can see, if you go one further, is that both the single band and the multi-band water index, they reproduce very well, even better, actually, kind of as a spot reference. As you can see like these finer channels, which is not really given in the M and the WI. If you go one further, unfortunately, those two water indices also pick up pixelation and water saturated soils. So that's why I have like these uneven pixelations for this. And of course, my air SWOT reference mask penalizes these kind of pixelations. So I think, like from my standpoint, like the M and WI is the best water indices to reproduce faithfully this kind of open surface water mask. Okay. Water. And this was kind of just a homework assignment what I did, and basically see what kind of water index reproduces best the results of a reference mask. So the next steps are to get a better reference mask, like with a high resolution, for example, or digital globe, which is kind of painful because I have to manually digitize like about 10,000 ponds and lakes. And then I can use it also to see, like, due to hyperspectral band, which bands are the most representative for each indices and so on. And then I can combine this in a machine learning approach. I can use segmentation and clustering. And what I really would like to do would be using convolutional neural networks like UNet to really find a perfect map that really is very close to this high resolution reference map. And then from there on, we do a lot more fun stuff. Thank you.
Thanks, Melissa. Are there any?
I think no question. I'm an opposer. Look me up. And we go to the next speaker. And the next speaker is Go Ivana from the International Arctic Research Center. We should
Change the slide by phone.
sure.
Can you open?
Thank you. This project aimed to better understand and quantify thermokarst processing happening on the North Slope, Alaska. So this region is very ice-rich and experienced the historically largest tundra fire. So you can see the fire scar, and we have 3 sites, and we also have an intact tundra site along the Dalton. And this presentation will highlight some research result from our ground survey and permafrost core analysis and L-band instant analysis. Okay, so we conducted 3-year GNSS survey for ground surface displacement at beginning and end of the sowing seasons. And the primary result from this survey was we found a low to moderate correlation between maximum soil depth and seasonal soil settlement. However, we found no correlation in the disturbed sites about these 2 parameters. So that it is somewhat reasonable because the deeper sowing depth merely indicates the larger potential of seasonal soil settlement. And surface disturbance will mess up this kind of relationship because seasonal soil settlement mainly depends on the spatial distribution of ice lenses. So, and we collected many frozen ground samples at the Anactic River fire scar to see if what's happened before and after the tundra fire. So we found a significant difference in water isotope profile at burn site and increased soil moisture in the active layer and upper near surface permafrost layer. So that confirmed the deep thawing after the tundra fire and recovering within 10 to 15 years. So from L-band INSA analysis, we revealed very detailed time series response of tundra against the wildfire. So from left, you can see the yellow to reddish color as up to 10 centimeters subsidence just after the fire, exclusively at the burnt area. But within 10 years, you see mostly greenish color, which indicates stable land in this particular year. But if we use a 4-year acquisition of star data and conduct some time series analysis called SDAS, we see the reverse relationship. So within the intact tundra, we saw larger subsidence, but in the burnt area, we see less subsidence in this case. But we see some thermal subsidence signal in patchy pixels within burnt area too. So this kind of result can be deduced from the INSA analysis, but it was very, very challenging to scale up this kind of data because of the influence of ionosphere and troposphere effects. So we went to the different direction toward finer scale. So this is an example of INSA analysis with finest spatial resolution. So this is an example of degrading Gedma hill. in electric river fire. So I was so excited looking at this kind of spatial pattern because it was closely related to the spatial pattern of ice-phase polygon network. If we compare with the microtopography, we found the large subsidence in the vicinity of ice-phase polygon lines, not in the trough, but the vicinity of the trough. So if we worsen the spatial resolution from 5 meter to 10 meter, you don't see any detail of spatial pattern like we can see in the left side. So 5 to 7 meter is some kind of a critical value to understand thermal processes in the scale of ice-phase polygon. So those are our highlights. So I have posters, so you're welcome to drop by for further discussion.
You go. Are there any questions while we set up the screen for the next speaker?
Our next speaker is Kazim from the University of Southern California, and he's talking about microwave instrumentation and how to model mapping water and carbon cycle variables.
All right, thank you, everybody. My name is Kazim. I'm working at USC with Professor John Kimball and Professor Malcolm Moqaddam. Today, I'm going to talk about the microwave instrumentation and models to map the water and carbon cycle variables in the Arctic permafrost. I wanted to acknowledge my findings from NESSF and above. Next slide, please. Okay, so Arctic is a vast and very harsh environment. It has a very harsh environment. To study the permafrost dynamics and vulnerability to a changing climate, we need to study water and carbon as the major subcomponent of the subsurface. One way to study these parameters is P-band and L-band microwave remote sensing techniques that it has been shown that the backscatter of the radar is sensitive to the dielectric, subsurface dielectric and geometry. Next slide, please. So the core of a radar-based retrieval or a studying of the subsurface permafrost active layer consists of 3 steps. First is a subsurface profile model that we need to model the subsurface soil moisture and organic matter content as a major 2 component that is important. And then to link the soil properties to the radar scattering measurement, we need to have an organic soil dielectric model, which is input is the soil properties, organic matter and saturation water fraction, and it derives the dielectric profile. From there, we can incorporate that dielectric profile into a radar scattering model to give us the radar backscatter properties. Next slide, please. We have first developed and did in situ measurement to come up with generic functions that characterize the subsurface profile. So that on the left, what you see is the organic matter profile for various sites, and then the saturation water fraction, which is a quadratic function. Next slide, please. Once we have that, the major characteristics of the active layer is really high organic matter content. But such a model, a soil dielectric model, is not existed to be included in a remote sensing model. So we had to come up with a model that can relate the inputs of our study, which is soil moisture and organic matter content, and then relates it to soil dielectric. Here is the schematic. I don't want you to look at all the details, but the overall idea is how we get from the subsurface soil properties into the soil dielectric. And next slide, please. This work has 2 parts, which we call it a coupled hydrologic and electromagnetic approach. The first, the major component of the subsurface and that governs the dielectric behavior is the water. So basically, the water dielectric behavior in soil is unknown, and nobody can predict how it behaves. So we came up with the idea of we relate the soil water retention curve, which is a hydrology parameter, to the soil dielectric parameter, which is to the water dielectric parameter in the soil, which is the electromagnetic perspective. So we use an approach that start from the soil properties and then predict the soil water retention curve, and from there we can predict the organic soil water dielectric properties in the soil. Next slide, please. So we have done this through a joint measurement. So we have first measured the matrix potential, and then once we characterize the soil water retention curve, then we have the water dielectric behavior in soil. And then from there, we needed to incorporate that dielectric inside a mixing model that incorporate different contribution of soil phases. So here's what you see is the validation of the organic soil dielectric model that used that combined approach, and showing like different organic matter content from very small organic matter all the way to 100% very organic. And these are like validation. This is the most comprehensive measurement that is out there. It's like 66 soil samples, and the dielectric is being measured for the whole range. Next slide, please. This work is focused on modeling and also instrumentation. One of the main challenges of any dielectric measurement is the disturbance on the soil. So us as physics-based radar retrieval modeler, we want to study the environment as it is. So when we collect soil samples from environment and then we insert a probe or insert other instrument to measurement, we are basically disturbing the soil, whether we compress the volume or we apply other methods to just fill inside of something. So I had to develop a new imaging system. This is a non-destructive way to reconstruct the dielectric of any soil samples. So what we see here consists of 32 antenna that works as receiver and transmitter, and then it has like an imaging cavity that is filled with a matching fluid to improve the matching. And then we have these 3 containers. So you basically can go to the Arctic, collect your soil samples, put it in a small container, and that's like the minimal disturbance that you can create on the soil to just bring it to the lab and then put it inside this and measure it. And then you can just take it out, leave it in the air for some other soil moisture and measure it again. Next slide, please. This instrument was needed to verify the model behavior in the P and the L band, which is the operation frequency band of the radar. So I had, this is some of the preliminary results. What I'm showing here is a different synthetic test sample that basically mimics the dielectric behavior from very saturated all the way to the dry region. It's like all the way to 80, 70 to 2. And then the system is working properly. So we can later on put soil sample in it and then show that, okay, this P band and the L band, which is 430 megahertz and 1260, can capture the dielectric behavior. So with this, can you go to slide 3?
Your time is actually up.
Yeah, I'm just done. So
This one?
Yeah, just one more. Sorry.
Oh, no.
So with this, we have basically put together all the pieces of a puzzle. So we have a subsurface model, we have also the organic soil dielectric model, and we have an electromagnetic forward scattering model. So this is all the forward side of this retrieval algorithm. With that, we can retrieve the soil moisture and the water cycle basically, and the organic matter for studying the carbon cycle of the Arctic active layer. Thank you.
Thank you.
No, yeah, if you have someone a quick question. I mean, we have until 12, but we won't push it too much. And we go to our next speaker, which is remote. Nishima, are you here? Can you unmute yourself, please?
Can I share my screen?
Yes, please.
Click the stop share.
Okay.
Thank you.
Nishima is a PhD student from Brown University, and she's talking about topographic mapping of surface water, drainage patterns, and hydrological connectivity on the Canadian Shield. So we go a little bit more east this time.
Thank you so much. So I'm presenting on topographic mapping of surface water drainage pattern and hydrological connectivity on the Canadian Shield. Let's talk about why should we study surface drainage pattern of Canadian Shield. We should study surface drainage pattern of Canadian Shield because it has world's highest lake density and has many topographical depressions, and projected future weather condition may alter surface drainage pattern and increase hydrological connectivity of the depressions of the Canadian Shield. And we are trying to find the answer of the question of how may our future weather Arctic climate affect the surface drainage pattern of the Canadian Shield from this project. So Canadian Shield surface hydrology relies on fill and spill hydrology, and it is a critical control on downstream flow patterns and river discharge. When one lake gets filled, it gets spilled to another lake, and the another lake gets filled, and the process continues on. So in this project, I'm selecting initial working area. I'm working on the initial working area, which is Baker Creek, and it is located in sub-Arctic Canadian Shield near Yellowknife City, northern Western Territories, and its fill and spill hydrology is well documented by different researchers, and we have well image of Arctic dam in this area. So these are the methods which we are applying for work in our project. And first we take original Arctic dam and fill that Arctic dam and subtract with original Arctic dam to create the depression storage map. And this is the map of the depression storage, and we map the drainage pattern using different inundation depth and using least cost path analysis. And this is the map of the drainage pattern which we have mapped using different least cost path analysis. And finally, we determine the relationship between landscape scale, depression storage, and assumed inundation depth. So what happens if we increase the inundation depth by 10 centimeters? So we can see that there are few depressions which gets filled with a 10 centimeter increase in inundation depth, and new streams are formed from there. And if you increase 20 centimeter with the inundation depth, then few new depressions are filled and new streams are formed. And likewise, and with the 30 centimeter increase in the inundation depth, new streams are formed and few more depressions are filled. And with 50 centimeter, almost 90% of the depressions are filled and new streams are formed. And with 100 centimeter increase in the inundation depth, almost 99% of the depressions of the Baker Creek region is filled and new streams are formed. So this is the graph of surface areas and depression storage volumes for different assumed inundation depth. With 50 centimeter depression storage is largely filled, and looking at the individual graph, you can see that in 30 centimeter increase in inundation depth, 80% of the surface area is filled, but only 60% of the volume is filled, which indicates that there are many depressions which have shallow depths. And this is the graph of the count of the connected depressions with different increasing inundation depth. So we can see that by 50 centimeter inundation depth, most of the depressions are connected with each other. And so finally, we can say that some surface water drainage pattern of Canadian Shield can be readily modeled using high resolution DEMs, and with just increase in 20 centimeter in regional water balance, we can see 70% of the 70% of the depressions are filled, and the number of interconnected lakes increased by 835. And with just 50 centimeter increase in regional water balance, we can see almost 100% of the depressions are filled, and number of interconnected lake increased by 1189, and many streams would be formed, but the overall drainage pattern remains stable with a 1 meter increase in inundation depth. And finally, we conclude that Canadian Shield surface water depression storage and hydrological connectivity is highly sensitive to future changes in regional water balance. And future work will explore the potential sensitivity of the Canadian Shield drainage patterns to changing future water balance as projected by regional climate model. So thank you for listening. If you have any questions, you can email me on nimisa_wagle@ brown.edu. Thank you.
Are there any questions in the room or online? So I actually have a question. Taking your conclusions, how do you think this surface water will change, or also like groundwater on the Canadian Shield? What do you expect with like the next 50, 100 years?
So the Canadian Shield will, so in the weather condition, the Canadian Shield will, the depressions of the Canadian Shield will fill, and it will be much wetter in the future.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. So we go to we go to our next speaker, Kevin Turner from Brock University, and he brings us back a little bit further east to the Yukon, to Old Crow Flats.
Okay.
You pass it.
Oh.
Pass it. The first one, spatial. No spatial planet. Oh. Yep.
Okay, so this is a photograph of Old Crow Flats. I've been working in this area now this is coming up on the 16th year that I've been going back.
Could you come towards us? The microphone is here.
Yeah, okay. So it's a thermokarst landscape. It's 15,000 square kilometers. It's a headwater node basically of the Yukon River Basin. And so what I'm going to talk about today are, next slide, a couple of the disturbances that have been noticed by members of the Vantakwichin First Nation, as well as some of our science-based measurements. And across this landscape, we can see things like greening. We have drained lakes, which we've been monitoring, tracking the number of them and the size, that kind of thing, and thaw slumps, and as well fire. So it's got kind of a nice mix of a whole bunch of different types of disturbance, and it's important that we monitor, see how they are changing over time, their magnitude, but also how they're influencing the lakes and the rivers, which are really the foundation of this, the ecosystem. Vantakwichin means people of the lakes. The lakes are very important, and that's actually where the research started for me. I'll get into talking about drained lakes and thaw slumps a little bit, but next slide. This is a subset of 14 lakes from an original 58 that we used to monitor between 2007 and 2009. And since then, we've been taking water samples in June, early on in July as well, and then late August, early September. And the water isotope tracers have been very valuable for us to understand differences in the hydrology of these lakes. And this is the subset sampling for these is carried on by Parks Canada since about 2011. Go ahead. And what we're noticing from that, so this is a paper that we just published last year. They're telling us, and actually the way the last presentation ended, this one continues, it actually works well because we're seeing this overwhelming increasing signature in rainfall. So we can do a few things with the water isotopes, model actually what the proportion of rainfall versus snowmelt is. It's difficult to really partition out the influence of thawing permafrost or active layer with rainfall, but they tend to be similar. So we can't necessarily cancel out the fact that we're getting increased ground ice as well. But the point is the influence of snowmelt in these lakes is going down, rainfall is going up. And regardless of how different these lakes were, and they were very different hydrologically early on, they're all converging on this more homogenized rainfall signature. This is telling us, giving us an indication of the overall landscape without actually looking at the remote sensing at this point. This is telling us that we're getting we're getting more hydrological connectivity laterally across the landscape. And it's an indication that it's also being primed for continued disturbance and change. Next slide. So that's where, and also where this is sort of the next up part of that, where we're actually seeing this influence happening downstream as well. And so it's difficult to see, but we have the early season and the late season. This is the delta water isotope plots. And the yellow points, yellowish to green to blue, that follows chronologically from 2007 to mid to most recent. And we can see the separation in the isotopes of the blue from the yellow. And these are all creeks, either headwaters or downstream. Headwaters, downstream. Regardless, over that time frame, we're seeing this. They're also following this rainfall signature and being more influenced by this, so that connectivity is really happening. Okay. So this is, in addition to monitoring what's going on downstream, we're also looking at or tracking some of these changes on the landscape, what might be influencing those downstream conditions. And so my colleague Trevor Lance and I put a paper out in 2015 where we saw an increase in the frequency of lake drainage events. So fast forward, we need to update this because this really only goes up to about 2010, and I'll come back to that. But another thing that we've been focusing on is looking at what happens to the aquatic environment in these situations when you have this drastic transition. And so we've got a combination of water chemistry, water isotopes for this given basin that drained Zoma Lake, that drained in 2007. And I coupled that with some water maps, and the MNDWI was actually the best for us, for me as well. And then we took some vegetation or basically shrub encroachment maps using NDVI. And the overlap we assumed was inundation, but I know there's fancier ways to do that. Either way, we found highly variable surface water area changes over that time, and then we also have water chemistry and isotopes that follow that pattern as well. They're super dynamic all over the place for the first 5 years. But what happened is the shrub stabilized that former lake bed. And so the pluvial runoff that brought in all the solutes and all the nutrients sort of didn't get amplified quite as much. And it's like it stabilized that aquatic environment after about 7 years. And so either way, we're going to, this one is actually just out now in Arctic Science. It's an early, I forget what they call it, but it's an early read right now. So check that out. Keep going. So we also want to update our database of where lakes have drained, and water maps are useful for that, but we're still early on in doing that. And so the question is, like, how many are draining? What's the magnitude of them? Can we take what we learned from that Zoma Lake example and apply it effectively across the landscape? And I've got a handful of these where I've identified, like, many actually drained lakes in this area. So I presented this in Old Crow and in the fall, and they were quite interested in locating where these were. And it seems as though there's a whole bunch. So we need to refine our understanding of the amount of water, how much change has happened. Next. This is an example of the mass. The lake that drained over from 2019 basically to 2021, and we flew by it. We can see that it was a fresh drainage event, and so I've identified many of these new ones, and so it's important to keep that going. And what else do we have? Actually, can you go to the next one? I'll come back to that. Sorry. You can hit play on that video if you like. So the other thing that we do is look at inventory thaw slumps. And so we've got some, I've got what, 1, 2, 3, 4, 7 drone surveys that I've done since 2016 on the largest lands, or the thaw slump in Old Crow Flats. And we take water samples upstream and downstream. We do the photogrammetry calculations to see the volume change. It's after 2021, it's grown to 1.32 hectares. It's not like the 300 hectare ones that we're seeing across the border, but we're going to continue to monitor this one because it really jumped during 2021. And you can refer back to a paper if you're interested in this, where we utilize a whole bunch of different UAV techniques to characterize the different geomorphological components of the thaw slump. And this actually ties in really well with our stream monitoring network, where we can see how these types of episodic events are influencing downstream. So just now, can we go back to that and I'll finish just on that. So we have this creek that we flew over in August, September. You can see how muddy the water is. And we didn't see anything upstream. I thought immediately it was a lake that was draining out or thaw slump or something. We didn't find it right away. We were in a bit of a hurry. So we're going to go back this year. This is where an Avarice line and there are SAR lines that follow this as well from the airborne campaign. So Chip is actually adjusting that to go over, because I think it probably originated from this feature there that looks like it burned. This might be a subsequent slump in that area. So we're interested to go back. And if anyone's interested, we're using this now for, oh yeah, you can, for some of our surveys of these types of features. You can go to the next one. And you can get data like this. This is a point cloud just from me walking around for about 15 to 20 minutes around the slump. And so we can use that to identify the volume of these types of features. And it's kind of a neat toy. So I brought it with me because I'm living out of a truck in Seattle right now. So here it is. It's LiDAR. Yeah. Yeah. And this just spins. And anyway, I think I'm done.
Okay, great. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Are there any quick questions before our last speaker?
And then took data from the samples. Just run this one.
Could you just come up again? Like the question was if there are any isotope data from
the permafrost. We do from a while ago. We don't have a lot of examples, but there's also, I think, more. We found that the water isotope data for permafrost, back when I was looking at it, is closer to rainfall than it would be snow, and it kind of bounces around the average isotopic composition of annual rainfall. So it's closer to rain than it is snow. So it's difficult to partition the relative influence of rainfall versus some permafrost. But we can't cancel it out. But Bandara and Dwayne Fraze and those folks at U of A have also done some really good analysis of that.
Thank you so much. So our next speaker, please don't kill me. I'm really notoriously bad in pronouncing name. Shua, from Montana University, and talking about spatial patterns and trends of active layer thickness over northern permafrost regions from 2003 to 2020. And you're using machine learning, which I'm really looking forward to hear about.
Can you hear me well?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah, hello everyone. My name is Zhihua Liu. Sorry you can't see me because I don't have a webcam here. So we are working on to produce a long-term observational-based graded active layer thickness over the northern permafrost region. Today I'm going to briefly introduce our preliminary results. Before I start, I really want to thank all my collaborators from University of Montana, Woodwell Climate Research Center, Tongji University, and many others. So rapid climate warming has sparked lots of interest to understand the thermal state of permafrost and the results on the consequence on ecology, environment, and the society over the permafrost region. So active layer thickness is a key indicator for the thermal state of permafrost, but long-term observational-based graded ALT data layer is still lacking. So our objective for this study is to produce an observational-based graded ALT dataset and to understand the spatial pattern and the trends of ALT from 2003 to 2020 over the northern permafrost regions. Our study area include circumpolar permafrost region and the Tibetan Plateau.
I'm sorry, Zhihua. I think there's an issue with the screen sharing. We're still seeing your first slide.
Okay. Melissa, can you please slide for me?
Sure, yeah. I think this.
Yeah, I'm not sure what's going on, but I can't see the screen. Okay, yeah. Sorry for that. Next, please.
Yeah. 1 second.
Yeah, I just briefly introduce the objective is to produce an observational based graded ALT dataset and understand the spatial and the temporal pattern of ALT from 2003 to 2020 over the northern Permafrost regions. So our study area include circumpolar Permafrost region and the Tibetan Plateau. Next, please. So in this study, we use random forest regression algorithm within the Google Earth Engine platform. We compiled a total of nearly 3,000 set year ALT measurement data from 4 different sources. We use ALT measurement between 1 and 99 percentile for the random forest model. Our graded predictor includes satellite observations of land surface temperature, vegetation, soil moisture, snow and free thaw conditions at annual time scales. We also include topographic variables and latitude, which are static over the study period. All this dataset will resemble to 1 kilometer spatial resolution. Next, please. Here is the long-term mean ALT over the northern Permafrost region. Generally, it captures the broad pattern of ALT distribution with the depth of ALT increasing from the high to low latitude. The ALT is between 2 to 3 meters in Tibetan Plateau, which is more consistent with local ALT measurement data. Cross-validation dataset with a circumpolar active layer modeling dataset also show very high correlation and no systematic bias. Next, please. So this is the ALT trend from the 2003 to 2020 from our random forest derived dataset. So what we can see is there is a widespread deepening of ALT over the Permafrost region, which is consistent with our expectation. To verify this trend, we conduct a set level comparison between the COM measurement and our remote random forest derived ALT data. To do so, we first select 57 COM sets with at least 10 years of measurements, and then we extract our random forest predict ALT. We also extract ALT data from the ESA CCI Permafrost product, which is based on a modeling approach. So first, all 3 ALT data have shown that over 80% of set has a deepening trend, and they also agree pretty well spatially. Using these 57 sets, our ALT data set showed the deepening trend is around 0.69 centimeter per year, which is not statistically different from the COM measurement, but is indeed lower than the ESA CCI ALT dataset. Next, please. To conclude this presentation, we have produced a long-term observational constant ALT dataset at 1 kilometer spatial resolution from 2003 to 2020 over the whole northern Permafrost regions. Our ALT data shows some improvement over the previous dataset, especially over the Tibetan Plateau region. So our dataset also show a widespread ALT deepening trend, but the rate of ALT deepening is not as strong as previously estimated. So if please stop by our poster or email to me if you want to know more about our study. Please also let me know if you want to contribute to this work. For example, if you have any ALT data to share that or comment at it on the manuscript, we are we are ready to wrap up this up. Thank you, and please let me know if you have more questions. Yeah, that's all.
Are there any questions from the audience or from the Zoom audience?
Jason, could you please come up?
Yes, thank you. Speak into the microphone.
It looked like your random forest model did a good job predicting mean active layer thickness, but it maybe underpredicted some of the larger decreasing trends. Is there
Yes.
any ideas of what variables might be missing from the random forest to account for those larger trends?
I think probably is temperature trend, because there are some slides I didn't show. When we look at land surface temperature trend, we actually see a lot of places showing a very decrease in land surface temperature over the summer season. So we expect, this may be caused by our land surface temperature measurements. Yeah, I think it's because for the temperature trend is not as strong as previously used by the atmosphere measurements, the air temperature.
I have like a follow-up question to that. Why did you use a random forest regression? This is always a question, or a forest model. What I asked, like, why not a convolutional neural network?
There are a couple of reasons. First, I think I'm more familiar with this random forest approach. The second one is, it can be done within the Google Earth Engine platform. So it's integrated in the, GE platform. Maybe other approaches are also, integrate into the platform, but I'm not, very familiar with those approaches. Having said that, the random forest generally perform very well in predicting this kind of geospatial data set. I can try other approaches, but I'm not sure what the performance will be.
Thank you. Yeah, from my experience, random forests do actually a pretty good job.
Yeah, usually perform very well.
Yeah, in comparison to support vector machines and so on. But,
yeah.
Thank you. Any more questions? Are there any other questions for our presenters here or online? We still have like 20 minutes. We could fill. Anyone? No, then I think we close it. So Simon and I would like to thank all of our presenters today and for the participation of the audience here in Fairbanks and on Zoom. And just come back tomorrow, same time, same room, for the second part of Permafrost and Hydrology here. And for the audience in here, please come to the poster tonight. Yeah, that's it, basically. Thank you so much. Happy lunch.
Now we're recording the main.
Yeah.